real estate transaction, or the whole idea of buying a house, is a process. And sometimes during that process, either the seller or the buyer are going to experience something called bad news. Bad news. It's the real estate show. Welcome to the Real Estate Show. My name is Rick Naples. I am the owner-broker of Zone Realty LLC. You zone your home. And I'm filming today from the Zone Realty office in Plainville, Connecticut. And I wanted to talk on this show about the concept or the reality of bad news. Bad news seems to be around us. It happens. But sometimes bad news is not all that bad. It depends on what we make of it and how we try to correct it. When it comes to a real estate transaction, because it's a process, and it could be a very long process, there are a lot of opportunities for bad news to rear its ugly head. Usually when a seller decides to put their home on the market, the idea is to attract buyers who may want to buy that home. And buyers, sometimes during the transaction, will get bad news as they go along. And it depends on how they handle it as to how that transaction may proceed. So let's talk about bad news itself. Is bad news really bad news? Well, sometimes bad news in a real estate transaction is just a challenge that you need to try to overcome. So let's start at the very, very beginning. You're a buyer, and you decide that you want to purchase a home. So you contact a couple of mortgage companies, and you go through the process of the interview. You give them your credit information and your income information and all the different things that they require, so they can run some numbers and generate either a pre-qualification letter or a pre-approval letter for you, which will allow or let you see how much you can afford based on your credit and income. Bad news, you don't qualify. You're just not in a position to be able to qualify to get a mortgage. And there could be a number of reasons behind that, but that's the first challenge. And there are ways to work to get yourself to a point of where you can get a pre-qualification or a pre-approval. So let's say that that process gets done. You call the contact of a mortgage originator, and now you've got your mortgage approval in place, a pre-qual or a pre-approval letter, and now you know what price range you can shop in, and you start to go out and look at a house or houses. So you hire a realtor and you start looking. And you go out and you look at one house, and you look at another house, and you look at another house. And it just seems you can't find a house that fits your needs or in the price range that you can afford. Bad news. On top of that, because of COVID and what we just came out of, the inventories are still low. So there's not a lot of houses to look at. Bad news. So now you kind of play a waiting game, and you hope that eventually more houses will come on the market and you'll be able to find one that's going to fit your needs. Now the next step happens. Let's say you find a house. Great, fits your needs. It has a number of bedrooms, bathrooms, the yard, location, all the things that were on your needs list, and even a few things on your want list. And you make an offer. Bad news, the offer you made was not accepted by the seller. Either they counter-offered back or they accepted an offer from someone else, and you're not getting that house. All right, so let's say that you've gotten your pre-qualification letter, you've found a house that you like, you've made an offer, and that offer is accepted. Fantastic. Looks like we're going to move forward in the transaction. But now you have to hire a home inspector, or you should hire a home inspector to thoroughly go through the home so you can actually see what the condition is and what you're buying. I'll be back to talk a little bit about more of that right after this presentation. So now we've got a house. The sellers accepted our offer. And now we're going to do our home inspection. So we meet the home inspector at the home and everything works out right. And we spend our 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it might be in that house. And the home inspector goes through all the different systems and looks at all the conditions and all the ins and outs of the house itself and provides you with a report. And you start to go through the report and you're reading what the inspector is advising and what they have found. Bad news. The house is not as perfect as you thought it was. There's issues. There's problems. Some of them might be really severe. Others might not be that severe. So you go back to your realtor and you discuss some of those items and decide you want to reapproach the seller and negotiate on seeing if you could have some, if not all of those items, corrected before you move forward in the transaction. Could be a short list, could be a long list. Realtors are trained in interpreting the inspection reports, and they pretty much know from their experience what things sellers might agree to fix and what things they may not want to fix. And sometimes sellers don't have the ability to fix anything, and they'll just offer you a credit towards the purchase price of the house so that you can go ahead and fix those things yourself. Bad news. The seller says no. They're not going to fix anything. I'm not going to offer a credit. I'm not going to fix anything. If you want the house, you got to get it as is. Okay, so now you have to decide, do you want to move forward in the transaction or do you want to rescind or end the transaction, back out of the deal? And back out of the deal. All right. Well, let's say that the home inspection goes fine. And there's very few items, and they're minor items. You can take care of them yourself. So there is no more negotiation. So now the pre-qual is in place, you found the house, you made the offer, the sellers accepted the offer, you've gone through the home inspection process, the home inspection came out okay, everything looks good, now it's time to move ahead. Now your bank hires an appraiser, and the appraiser goes out and looks at the house and puts a value on it. And that value, hopefully, is what you've offered on the house. Because bank's not going to loan on a house unless they're sure that their monies are secured by the value of that house. Bad news. The appraiser underestimated the house. In other words, the house has not appraised for what you want to buy it for. So now what happens? Well, now your offer's going to fall apart. Or the seller would have to agree to lower the price to the bank's appraisal amount. Bad news, seller don't want to lower the price. Now what happens? Well, do you come up with the additional cash to make up the difference on your own over what you can finance? Or do you back out of the deal? Bad news again. Perhaps you're already stretched. You don't have the money to do that. So the deal falls apart. Bad news. Let's take a look at this, and I'll be back to talk a little bit more about other ways bad news can rear its ugly head in a real estate transaction. We're talking here on the Real Estate Show about bad news and how it rears itself up sometimes during a real estate transaction. It's very important to be prepared as you decide to buy a house. You want to make sure you have everything in place. You also have to be very careful to not allow the excitement of purchasing a home to overtake you. There's a tendency sometimes that people are buying a house and all of a sudden they start thinking about furniture they're going to need, bedroom furniture, living room furniture, supplies for the kitchen. I need a lawnmower, I need a snowblower, I need this, I need that. And they all of a sudden go out on a spending spree buying all the stuff that they're going to need for their new home. Bad news. The bank pulls the credit just before the closing and discovers you've incurred, because you've used your credit cards, some additional debt. And your what they call a debt to income ratio does not fall within the parameters to allow them to make that mortgage. The deal falls apart. Bad news. What we learned from that is when you do get an accepted deal on purchasing a home, hold off your spending until after you've closed. So let's review. You decided to buy a house. You found one. You got a pre-qualification letter. You made an offer. The offer has been accepted. Everything's great. You now go and do a home inspection. There's a few issues, but you can handle them. No big deal. Or the seller negotiated with you and everything's great. The bank sent out their appraiser. The house has been appraised for the value of which it's being purchased for. So that's all great. So now you hope that you move to your next step, which is to hear the words from the bank that you're clear to close. In other words, all the monies are in place and we're ready to schedule with the attorneys. Bad news. Turns out as the underwriters were going through the mortgage process, they discovered a few things that they want some additional answers to. So they may offer you a mortgage commitment, but it's conditioned. In other words, in order to give you this mortgage, we need this, we need that, we want this, we want that. And sometimes, some of the things that they want, you just don't have. and it may take time for you to assemble those things. Bad news, the deal may fall apart. But maybe not. Maybe you can put those things together. Now let's say that that process works out well, and you finally get it clear to close. And now it's time for the attorneys to schedule the closing. And in the original purchase agreement, you had put a projected date that you want to close on the house. And the seller may have built their whole life around that closing date, especially if they're counting on selling their house to buy another house. So that closing date becomes really important. Bad news. The attorney is in court that day, can't schedule the closing. Bad news. The house the seller's buying isn't going to be ready to close on that date. Bad news. You find out that you need additional monies in order to close, and you've got to scramble to try to get that money up. Number of different ways bad news can appear its ugly head when you're getting to that particular point in time. But let's say you overcome that. You've gone through all this process and everything's worked out, and you finally are to the set where the closing's been scheduled, and you're now going to head to the attorney's office to close on the home you've wanted to buy. All the monies are in place, the banks approved the loan, the inspection was great, the appraisal was wonderful, everything is fine. And now you're getting ready to go and close on that home. Well, bad news may not let you go. I have experienced instances where everything is wonderful, and the day before the closing, or the week before the closing, the buyer gets news which is bad, and it changes the whole thing. I'm talking about they get laid off from their job. The job ends. Now there's no income source coming in. Banks don't tend to like to loan money to an individual that doesn't have gainful employment. So now after you've gone through all these different things, bad news catches up to you and the whole deal falls apart. But maybe not. Let's say everything's gone wonderful. You've gotten through all the processes. You got that clear to close. You've gotten to the attorney's office. You've gone through all the mortgage paperwork. The seller's happy. You're happy. And you get those keys to your new home. Is bad news now completely away? Maybe. I've been talking here on the Real Estate Show about the concept of bad news and how bad news tends to rear its ugly head at very many different points during the real estate transaction. And I talked about how sometimes when you have bad news, you can overcome it. Sometimes it's just a matter of taking a step back and re-preparing yourself to purchase the home. Maybe the timing's not right. You need a little bit more time to save up some dollars for a down payment. Or maybe it's not the time of the year for you to buy a home. Maybe you want to wait until the timing works out for you. Perhaps it's a house that you want to purchase, but that house needs some work. And you're not sure that you have the ability or the funds in place or the talents yourself to fix the things that might need to be fixed on that particular house. Bad news can rear its ugly head at a number of different points during the real estate transaction. It's important to stay focused, to stay calm, and to deal with each step as you go through the real estate transaction and be positive about it. To work with your mortgage person, to work with your realtor, to work with your attorney. Now, one thing I didn't mention, which can be another situation when bad news can pop its early head, is at the very, very end of the transaction. You're finally ready to close, and your attorney is going to do what's called a title search. Now, a title search just basically means that they've researched the owner of the home and the way that the house has been titled, and they've made sure there's no liens or encumbrances or anything on that title so that you can get ownership of the home. In other words, the title can transfer over to you. Bad news, there turns out that there's an issue with the title. And those issues can be unforeseen. I've had situations where we've gotten almost to the closing and we found out that not the seller that we're buying the home from, but the person who sold the house to them, that attorney way back then didn't correctly file the mortgage termination. So there's still an outstanding mortgage over and above the mortgage that the seller's paying off that didn't even know was there on the house. So your attorney has to work with the title company to go through and make sure that gets cleared, because it's usually a records problem, but it could delay your closing. So again, bad news sticks its early head up. Bad news is something that we all have to live with. Bad news is something that we have to overcome. It depends on how serious that bad news is and whether or not we have the ability or the tools or the processes in place to be able to overcome that bad news. Sometimes bad news is good news, and that's the whole topic of another show. But I want to end this real estate show with one final thought. No matter how bad the news is, if you keep pushing forward and keep a positive attitude, things should be able to come together and you'll get yourself into that new home. Oh, one more thing about bad news. This bad news is this episode of the Real Estate Show is over. Thank you for watching. My name is Rick Naples. I'll see you next time.